This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Welcome everyone to the Football Odyssey, part of the Sports History Network. This is your host, Aaron Harris. Today's episode is a conversation with Angelo DiBello. Angelo is a New York Giants fan of nearly 65 years and has witnessed some of the greatest players, coaches, and moments in NFL history. Angelo and I discuss his history as a Giants fan, the greatest players of the 60s and 70s, the iconic legacy of Vince Lombardi, and much more. If you enjoyed the interview, then feel free to subscribe and share. And, as always, thank you for listening.
So you've been watching football for a long time, and you have probably seen everything that a fan could see at this point. Do you remember the first football game you ever watched?
Well, I think I go back to like 1956, and the New York Giants won the NFL title that year. And I also watched part of what they called the greatest game ever played, which was the Colts and the Giants in 1958. But actually, it was a pretty sloppy game. There was turnovers, there was penalties, and they was tied at the end of regulation, or close to the end of the regulation, and Johnny Unitas drove the Colts down the field with precision. I mean, the guy was a master. I mean, he threw the ball 99% of the time to the right receiver. He had a left tackle who was in the Hall of Fame. His name was Jim Parker, and he protected Unitas' blind side magnificently. And he had some good receivers. One of them was what the hell's his name? He was slow, but had great hands, and he ran precise routes. I'll think of his name in a minute. And they scored the winning touchdown on a 1 or 2 yard plunge by a player who was from Wisconsin by the name of Alan the Horse Amici. And the Colts also had a pretty good defense. They had a guy who was a defensive end named Gino Marchetti, who has since passed away, and he is also in the NFL Hall of Fame. And I'm not sure if Lenny Moore was on that team. He may have been. And Lenny Moore went to Penn State. And it's funny about Johnny Unitas. Johnny Unitas went to the University of Louisville. And he was undrafted. This would have been probably around 1953. And he had a tryout. I think it was from the Pittsburgh Steelers. And they cut him. And somebody saw him playing in a Sandlot game. And he signed a contract with the Baltimore Colts. And the rest is history. Probably one of the 5 greatest quarterbacks in the history of the NFL. If for no other reason that the team that he played with had confidence in him. He called all his own plays. There was nothing coming in from the bench. And he was a master at just finding the open guy. So what else can I say about that?
It is amazing. It is amazing when you're talking about how he was cut by Pittsburgh, about how some things you just have to be at the right place at the right time. I mean, how someone could actually cut him, and then he goes on to have a stellar career. It could be mind-boggling to figure out what they were thinking when they did cut him.
Well, I'll give you my slant on that. The ability to evaluate talent and to project what a young player can become is probably an underappreciated talent in the NFL and in most other team sports. it's not just athletic ability, because Johnny Unitas was not a great athlete, but the guy was a great leader, had a good arm, and had a feel for the game. And he, had a lot of heart, too.
What about from the Giants of that era? Did you have any favorite players?
Yeah. The Giants in that era had, Frank Gifford. They had, what's his name, the linebacker, Sam Huff, who went to West Virginia. And I'll tell you a funny Sam Huff story later. But they had Jim Ketkavich, Dick Modulewski. I'm not sure if Del Schaffner was on that team. The quarterback was, he went to Mississippi. What the heck was his name? The head coach was Jim Lee Howell.
You're thinking about Charlie Connolly.
Chuck and Charlie Connolly, that's right. Very good quarterback. And he was eventually replaced by Y.A. Tittle, who played in 2 or 3 championship games with the Giants in the early 60s. Unfortunately, they didn't win. They lost to the Packers in 61 and 62, and they lost to the Chicago Bears in 63. And they were hard-fought games, except for the one in 61 where the Packers just beat the heck out of them. And the ironic thing is that the head coach for the Packers was Vince Lombardi, who was an assistant with the Giants up until about 1958, along with Tom Landry. And when Jim Lee Howell retired, somehow the Mariners decided to give the job to Allie Sherman. And because of that, Lombardi was hired by the Packers to be the head coach in 1959. And Landry became the head coach of the new franchise, the Dallas Cowboys. And both of them are in the Hall of Fame, and both of them are great head coaches. And I read a story somewhere that around 1960 or 61, Wellington Mara actually flew to Green Bay and had dinner with Vince Lombardi and asked him to come to the Giants. And Lombardi's answer was, it's too late, and I don't have a contract. So the answer is no. Lombardi was, the guy could have been the CEO of any Wall Street firm. That's how much of a leader he was. And, he said some things that people still repeat. One writer asked me, he says, Vince, why do you push your players so hard in practice and in the preseason? And his response was, fatigue makes cowards of us all. So he had the best conditioned team in the league, and they were as fresh in the fourth quarter as they were in the first quarter. And they didn't make mistakes. He did not tolerate mistakes. He could tolerate a physical mistake, but not a mental mistake. And
that seems to be his kind of signature, where he didn't really have too many plays in the playbook, but he made you run it over and over until you had it down in your sleep.
Over and over and over until it was you could do it in your sleep. And his teams in the 60s won 5 out of 9 championships. They won 3 NFL titles and 2 Super Bowls, although they didn't call it a Super Bowl back in 66 and 67. And he was under tremendous pressure because the 2 leagues had not merged yet, and it was still the NFL against the AFL. And in the first game, they played the Kansas City Chiefs, and I think the final score was something like 35-10, maybe 35-14. And In the second one against the LA Raiders, they won 33-14, I believe. So they were both pretty
I think they were
much
still in
blowouts.
Oakland. Yeah.
Yeah, Oakland Raiders,
But,
right.
Yeah.
I think back.
Do you think?
Yeah, go ahead.
Do you think that had the Giants, and this can apply to Tom Landry too, do you think the Giants would have been better off in the 60s if they had Lombardi or Landry as their head coach, or do you think that where they ended up?
Unquestionably. The Giants did a very poor job of drafting starting at around 1963 or 64. And for the next, I don't know, maybe 15 years, they were terrible. Terrible. I mean, they drafted guys like Rocky Thompson, who was terrible, and something Freeman or Freeman something. He was a wide end, a tight end, or a wide receiver who was a bust. So whoever was evaluating the talent on those teams back in that era had no idea what the hell he was doing. And Lombardi was a great talent evaluator, as was Tom Landry. And I'll tell you a funny story about that. By the way, Lombardi also said, winning is not everything, it's the only thing.
Mm-hmm.
And
that's becoming like his signature.
Yep. And he died early. He died from colorectal cancer. He was the coach of the Washington Redskins, and he was beginning to get them rounded up into shape to be a very good team. And he died, young man. And the strangest thing is that he actually started out as a high school football coach. I think it was some team called St. Mary somewhere. Might have been in New Jersey. And he became he went to West Point as an assistant, and the head coach retired, and Lombardi asked if he could become the head coach. And you know what they said? They said they're not ready to hire an Italian coach.
Yeah.
So he left, went to the NFL, and the rest is history, as they say. And in the 1930s, Lombardi was at Fordham University. He was actually studying to become an attorney, in a law degree, and he was on their football team in the 30s, and they were called the Seven Blocks of Granite. He was like 5'9" and weighed about 205 pounds. And, in the 1930s, the players were not as fast, not as big, not as strong as they are today, generally speaking. Although I think they were superior in the fundamentals of the game. I watch a lot of football, and there are certain things that just drive me crazy. Tackling is a lost art. They don't have tackle. They run into guys and try to knock them down. And if they don't wrap them up, guy gains another 10 to 15 yards.
And he gets hurt in the process.
Excuse me?
And the defender gets hurt in the process.
Well, I don't know who gets hurt. I mean, it's just a lack of fundamentals. I mean, they make a lot of mental errors. Plus, the NFL has become a very, very offense-oriented league. The defenses are, I think, I don't want to say picked on, but there is a disparity in the way the games are being called.
Well, and also too, they don't have full contact practices like they did back in those days. So it's going to take down.
Well, the union. Every time they renegotiate a contract, gets these stipulations that the players are off to Tuesday, they don't practice full pads. That now they practice. I think they start practice on Wednesday, and there are limitations on the OTAs and on things in training camp. I mean, some of them I know are for safety measures, but, something like that can be overdone.
Right. So to go back to Vince Lombardi, and this is something I'm curious about, what do you think it was that made him such an iconic coach? And by that I mean, like, what made him different from other championship-winning coaches like George Halas or Paul Brown?
I think his attention to detail, and you're mentioning two guys who are in the Hall of Fame, so, I'm not going to say that Lombardi was even significantly better than either of those two. Paul Brown actually coached the Browns when they were not in the NFL. I think they were in the American Football Conference or something like that. And Otto Graham was the quarterback. And they had a fullback named Marion Motley, a pretty good player. And I think they won something like 6 out of 9 championships in the American Football Conference before they became an NFL team. And Paul Brown not only coached the team, he was the owner of the team. But I think the thing with Lombardi was he had a tremendous amount of drive to succeed. He was a taskmaster, but his players loved him. They loved him. Some of them cursed him out in practice and stuff like that, but they loved the guy. And when you have players like that will run through a brick wall for you, you got to be successful.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's how you kind of command respect. I mean, I think when you're a guy like Lombardi and being able to lead men, it takes a certain type of person to be able to make a grown man really want to run through a brick wall for you.
Yeah, he was also the GM. And
that's
so he was responsible for negotiating player contracts. And in those days, the player came in one-on-one to negotiate his contract. And there was a situation, probably 1962 or 63, where a player walked in and with another gentleman. And they sat down in front of Lombardi's desk in his big office. And Lombardi said, "Excuse me, so-and-so," talking to the player. "Who's that gentleman?" He says, "Well, that's my agent." He says, "I see." He says, "Could the two of you excuse me for about 10 minutes and wait out in the waiting room, and I'll call you back?" And they said, "Sure." Calls him back in 10 minutes later. Says, "I have good news for you," to the player. "I just traded you to the Philadelphia Eagles."
We talked about Cleveland earlier. Can you talk to me about the first experience you had watching Jim Brown play?
The guy was incredible. He had this knack of following his blockers, and he actually would put a hand on the blocker's back and steer the blocker in one direction or the other. And he would slide through the line of scrimmage sometimes sideways. And then when he squared up, it was instant acceleration. And it usually took 3 or 4 guys to get him. Once he had up ahead of steam, one guy didn't bring him down. That's how powerful he was. And I don't even remember him missing. He may have missed a play periodically. I don't ever remember him missing a series of downs, and certainly not a game. I mean, the guy was indestructible, and he had this act that he would pull on the other team. After he was tackled, he'd lay on the ground for about 3 or 4 seconds, get up like he was crippled, and stumble back to the huddle, and then the next play rip off a 25-yarder. So he was not only a great athlete, but he was a smart athlete. It's unfortunate that during those years when he was with the with the Browns, that they really didn't have, he was the offense for many of those years. There was one year, I guess it was 64, 65, where they finally got got him some help. They had Paul Warfield and Gary Collins and Frank Ryan, and I believe they beat the Colts in the slop. It was raining and the field was very muddy, and Jim Brown had a great game. He retired. He was 30 years old. The man was indestructible, and he was only 30. And I think he gained for his career something like 12,000 yards. And he could have played another 5 or 6 years. but he was making $30,000 as a football player and getting $300,000 to make movies in Hollywood. So it was not a tough decision for him to retire from football.
Right. Was he the? Do you think he was the best player?
What's that?
Do you think he was the best player of all time?
Best football player of all time, yes. And I was not a Browns fan. I was a Giants fan. But best football player of all time. And the only person who's close is Jerry Rice.
Is there another running back that you think is close to Jim Brown in terms of the impact he had, for his team or even on the game itself?
Yeah. Well, the kid from the Lions who retired early, what the heck was his name again?
Barry Sanders.
Barry Sanders, very good running back. Eric Dickerson, very good running back. Walter Payton, very good running back. O.J. Simpson, in spite of his character problems, was a very good running back. I think Jim Brown was, frankly, in a class by himself. Those other guys are, reasonably close, but Jim Brown was. There's only one Jim Brown. And what more can I say about him? I mean. And then there was a kid who was drafted in 1960 or 61, who also went to Syracuse, and his name was Ernie Davis, and he was drafted by the Browns. Well, unfortunately for Ernie Davis and for the Browns, they discovered that Ernie Davis had leukemia, and he died at a very young age.
Wasn't his nickname the Express?
I don't know. That's a long time ago. That's 60 years ago.
I think they made a movie about him.
Really? Yes, you know something?
Yeah,
I think you're right. I think I recall seeing that some years back.
That's also also brings up the kind of the story of Gale Sayers and Brian Piccolo.
Yeah, Piccolo died of some form of cancer also, a young man. He actually led the country in rushing. And probably, let me see, what year would this have been? 1964, maybe? He went to Wake Forest and led the league in rushing. And he was not a big guy. He was maybe 5'11", 205 pounds. And the other players in the country who were bigger, Tucker Fredrickson and Chuck Mersine and a few other guys. And he and Gale Sayers, I think, were drafted in the same year. And Gale Sayers went to Kansas. And Gale was about 5'10", 180 pounds. And they called him the Kansas Comet. And I'm trying to recall. I remember there was a college all-star game or one of those games, and there's this coach who was had 3 or 4 or 5 running backs, and and these other running backs were big, strong, athletic guys, and he's saying to Gale, you really can't compete with these guys. And which was, kind of stupid because I don't even think he knew who Gale Sayers was. But I saw the game that the Bears played in San Francisco. It was this old stadium called Kezar Stadium, and it was a muddy field. It had been raining, and I seem to recall that Gale Sayers in that one game scored 6 touchdowns. It was either 5 or 6. I think it was 7, yeah. He scored 1 on a punt return, 1 on a kickoff return, 1 passing, and 1 running. I mean, you can't score more touchdowns any other way other than those 4. And it was just incredible. And then he had this terrible knee injury, and it ended his career. They didn't have the medical procedures then like they had today. I think he only played about 6 or 7 years, and he was an exceptional player.
And whenever I watch highlight reels of him, he has such a graceful way of running. It kind of contradicts the way Jim Brown played or other power runners of that era. He had such a unique style to him.
Yeah. Dale Sayers was pretty fast. And for his size, he was pretty powerful.
When we move into the 80s, that's when Bill Parcells comes into the picture for the Giants. Did you know Bill Parcells prior to retiring?
Never heard of him.
What was your reaction whenever they hired him? Were you hoping they would hire someone else, or did you think he was just going to last a couple of years and then?
No, I didn't know who he was, but I'm the kind of guy that gives somebody a chance. Prove what you're made of. And
what was it about him that really kind of turned the organization around?
Well, he was also a good talent evaluator. He would listen to players. If they said something, and he would think about it, and if he thought they were right, he would change something. If he didn't, he would keep, he would do it his own way. He was his own man, and he knew the game. He was an ex-player, and he had a good coaching staff. Listen, it's just like a quarterback. A quarterback is only as good normally as the team around him. Well, a head coach is the same thing. You've got to have talented players, and you've got to have a good coaching staff. That's just the way it is.
How would you rank them compared to some of the other great defenses throughout
history? The best defense I ever saw was the 1970 Steelers. But I would say that defense that the Giants had in the mid-'80s with Lawrence Taylor and Harry Carson, and let me see, Jim Burt, George Martin, Carl Banks, was in the top 5 of great defenses of all time. And also the 86 Bears, which, they had their 85 Bears. They had their their year of fame, but they petered out after that. I guess there was some defections, and maybe they re-signed certain players.
I never got to see Lawrence Taylor play live, obviously, but whenever I go back and watch some of his games, it just seems the guy is not even human at moments. I think he played a game with a separated shoulder against the Saints where he had to tape it up at halftime. Does that ring a bell?
Yeah. First of all, the man was a great athlete. He was probably the best punter on the team, even though he didn't punt. He also could kick field goals, although he wasn't the place kicker. And he was 6'3", 245, and ran like a running back. So he was he was strong, he was quick, and he was fast, and he played with a lot of emotion. And he had some character issues, obviously. And I remember watching a game with the 2 boys, and Lawrence Taylor was not playing well. And I said to him, something's going on with him. It turned out he was doing cocaine. And I guess he has since kicked the habit. I think he went for counseling and rehab for a short period of time. And you could make a case that Lawrence Taylor was probably the best defensive player in the history of the NFL. Although there were other guys, Reggie White was a great defensive player. There was a guy that played for the 70s Steelers called Mean Joe Green, who was a great defensive player. And the Packers and the Cowboys in the 60s and 70s had a guy named Bob Lilly, who's called Mr. Cowboy, great defensive player. Mel Blount for that 70s Steelers team was a cornerback, and they had to change the rules because of him because you now can't impede a wide receiver five yards past the line of scrimmage. Well, he would do it all the way down the field, and that Steelers team, that defense, I believe has 5 guys in the Hall of Fame and 1 who should be. Mean Joe Green is in it. Mel Blount is in it. Jack Ham,
Jack Lambert.
Jack Lambert. And I don't know about L.C. Greenwood, but if he's not, he should be. The guy was a tremendous player.
Yeah, he's not in the Hall of Fame. And he's had there's been a lot of people that have been pushing for him to get in for some years, but it still hasn't happened.
I'm not even sure he's still alive.
No, he passed away a few years ago.
Yeah, and they had another linebacker who was pretty good too. His name was Andy Russell. I'm not sure if he's in the Hall of Fame, but he was a very good ball player.
Yeah, he wasn't in the Hall of Fame. I think he was on the team for their first 2 Super Bowls, and then he retired, I think, after that 76 season. And I think that 76 season is the year where they had, I think, 5 shutouts, which is a remarkable achievement.
Yeah, and it was probably against a pretty good team too. And I saw the game when they beat the Vikings 16-6, I think it was, low scoring game. I think the Vikings had 2 field goals, and Fran Tarkenton was the quarterback. And that Steelers defense just shut them down. And the Steelers in those days had a undersized offensive line, but they were fundamentally sound. And there was also some rumors that some of those offensive linemen were doing, some, what do they call them today? Steroids or
performance enhancers.
Yeah. PEDs, PED, yeah. So, when you had Bradshaw, who was, a real gunslinger, had a strong arm, and they had some great offensive players too. They had Lynn Swann and Franco Harris, who was excellent running back in the Hall of Fame. And there was another wide receiver. I'm trying to remember his name. John Stallworth. Excellent player. And I seem to recall they had a tight. Yeah.
I think when it seems like talent evaluators are kind of the theme for great coaches, and I think Chuck Noll was as good as any of them.
Well, he won 4 titles, but the talent on that team was just terrific. I mean, I don't think there was a team that I've ever seen that had as many good, great players as that Steeler team in the 1970s. They beat some really, really good teams. They beat a Dallas Cowboys team, I think, twice. They beat an LA Rams team who was very good. And I'm trying to remember who the 4th team was. It was the Minnesota Vikings. They were all good teams. I mean, the Steelers defense just shut them down. I think one of the closest games was the game against either the Cowboys or Rams, where Jackie Smith, who was a former St. Louis Cardinal tight end, dropped a touchdown, and he was wide open, and the ball went right into his hands, and it went through his hands and off his chest. And if the Cowboys had scored that touchdown, they would have won the game because it was near the end of the game.
I think that's the game where the commentator said, "Bless his heart, he's got to be the sickest man in America."
Oh yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
So you've seen 4 Super Bowl victories in your lifetime. Which one stands out to you the most?
Oh,
the Giants.
The Giants. Well, let me see. I got to say it was the one against the Buffalo Bills because it was an oddly played game. The Giants didn't throw the ball very much. Phil Simms was hurt, so they had Jeff Hostetler as the quarterback, who was a great athlete. He went to West Virginia, and besides being the quarterback, he also played wide receiver because the guy was a good athlete and pretty fast. And they had Otis Anderson, who had a great game as the running back. And I seem to put Belichick was the defensive coordinator. And Parcells once made the statement, he says, Belichick's game plan was great. He says, but don't forget that the offensive coordinator on the team had a great game plan for the offense. So, and the Giants won the game 20-19, and the place kicker for the Buffalo Bills, I'm trying to remember his name, had a 47 or 48-yard field goal, and it was about 2 inches wide to the right, and the Giants wound up winning the game 20-19. So that was the closest game. What?
Scott Norwood was the kicker's name.
Scott Norwood, right.
I think I might know the answer, but if you could sit down with anybody in NFL history and have a conversation just one-on-one, who would you like to talk to?
Wow. Oh, man. Well, can I give you more than one?
Yeah, go for it. Give me your top.
I'd say Jim Brown, Lawrence Taylor. In all of the NFL?
Yeah.
Vince Lombardi. And I would pick those three guys. There's a funny story about... What's that? No, there's also a funny story. There was the Packers back in the 60s had a wide receiver. I'm trying to remember his name, but he was a real character. As a matter of fact, Lombardi's first year, they used to practice on a college campus somewhere in Wisconsin, and Lombardi had had the whole team in the classroom, and Lombardi, trying to be a smart-ass, picks up a football and says, "Team, this is a football." And one of the players, I'm trying to remember the guy's name, said, "Coach, could you go a little slower?" He was also a womanizer. I'm trying to remember the guy's name. He was actually an early investor in the Chi-Chi's restaurants too. And he caught 2 touchdown passes in the first Super Bowl against the Kansas City Chiefs.
Wasn't it McGee or something?
Max
along those
McGee.
lines?
Max McGee. And funny story, Lombardi would do bed check personally during the preseason, and they all slept in dorms in the college. And he would do bed checks. All the doors were unlocked, and I guess bed check was curfew time was 11 o'clock, or somewhere around there. And Lombardi, and there was usually two players to a room, and Lombardi walks into one room, and McGee's not in his bed. Lombardi reached outside the door for McGee to show up at 1 o'clock in the morning, or maybe he came back intermittently. And these guys in those days were making 8, 9, 10. Most of them had to have jobs in the off season because they couldn't support a family otherwise. They were making $10,000, $12,000 a year. And so McGee shows up, and Lombardi says, "McGee, you missed curfew. It's going to cost you $250. So, and that was a fine. So 3 nights later, Lombardi again. McGee's not in his room. McGee comes in. Lombardi catches him and says, "McGee, this is going to cost you $500." He says, "And the next one's going to cost you $1,000. And if she's worth $1,000, you let me know, and I'll go with you."
That's funny.
True story. But
I also read a. Go ahead.
Well, I was just thinking back to that Packer team. They also had a bunch of guys from the Hall of Fame. I mean, they had Herb Adderley, who was a great cornerback from. I think he went to Michigan or Michigan State, and he also played 3 or 4 years after his Packer days with the Dallas Cowboys and did very well. Willie Davis was a defensive end who was drafted, and he went to Grambling College. In those days, it was not a university; it was called Grambling College. And I think the coach of those Grambling teams, a great black coach, because Grambling is a black school, and he was Eddie Robinson. And he put some pretty good players into the NFL over the years. And they had, Henry Jordan was a defensive tackle, Ron Kostelnik. They had a safety, Bob Jeter, who was a very good ball player. Jim Taylor, who was a fullback drafted out of LSU, great player. I think he's in the Hall of Fame. Paul Hornung, who just died recently, went to Notre Dame. He was the Heisman Trophy winner, also played quarterback besides running back, and he was a place kicker. And Jerry Kramer.
Yeah. Kramer's a mountain of a man.
Well, he's not that big. I mean, I'm not sure if he's still alive. He was only like 6'2" and about 265 pounds. But you see, the thing is today, he played big because those guys were in shape. They didn't have that pot belly that you see on some of these offensive, defensive linemen today. You know, I mean, me and Joe Green was 6'4", he's only 275. Today you get the defensive tackle, same height, probably weighs 320. You know, with 330.
Yeah.
But the BMI is
a guy like Cam Newton today would have been an offensive lineman.
Who?
A guy like Cam Newton.
Maybe a tight end or a linebacker, but you had some pretty big quarterbacks back then. And I'll tell you, the quarterback for the Packers, I admired him greatly because he was soft-spoken.
Bart Starr.
His team admired him, Bart Starr. He was a 13th round draft pick for Alabama, and there was a film session one time, and with the whole team, and Bart and Lombardi started criticizing Bart Starr in front of the whole team for I guess a couple of plays that went wrong. And after the session, Bart Starr walked into, asked to see Lombardi, and he says, Coach, he says, I don't mind being criticized, but I don't think you should do it in front of the whole team because I have to be a leader on the team, and they have to have confidence in me. You know what Lombardi says?
Wow.
He says, Bart, you're right. I will never do it again.
And that's why. That's probably why his players loved him so much, because he understood where they were coming from.
Yep.
I think it's actually a similar story with Bill Walsh and Joe Montana. I think where Montana screwed up when they were scrimmaging, and he said something similar to Bill, and Walsh said, "Okay, I understand what you're saying."
Yeah.
And do you remember the rivalry between the Baltimore Colts and the Packers back in the 60s?
Yeah. There was a rival. The Packers had, several rivals. The Bears, who had a pretty good team, with Mike Ditka and pretty good defense.
That rivalry to me kind of seems like that would have been the reminiscent of the early Manning-Brady rivalries.
Yeah. Actually, I think the Packers' biggest rivalry was with the Giants, because the Packers beat the Giants in the NFL Championship game 61 and 62. I listened to the 62 game laying in my bed on radio because it was not on TV. And it was a very cold, windy day in New York. The game was played at Yankee Stadium. And I think the Packers wound up winning the game something like 16 to 19 to 10 or 19 to 12. It was a low-scoring game. The weather conditions were terrible. You could hardly throw the ball. I mean, the wind had wind gusts of 30 to 35 miles an hour, and it was just a cold day. And in those days, the NFL season was over by the end of December. It doesn't go into January, February like it does today. They play fewer games, and there were a lot fewer teams. And I think Lombardi's players knew how important it was to him to get a little, human nature being what it is, a little revenge on his old team. But that was a close scoring game. The one in 61, the Packers won handily. As a matter of fact, I recall I saw that game on TV in 1961, and Herb Adderley actually stole the ball from one of the Giants' wide receivers. Just took it right out of his arms. I don't know if it was Del Schaffner or Gifford or one of those guys, and took it right out of his arms and ran it back for a touchdown.
Now, I don't think comparing teams from decades really gets anywhere. But hypothetically, if you had to take the best Packers team of the 60s, and play them against the best Steelers team of the 70s, who do you think would win?
Yeah. Steelers.
Really?
Yeah. Although it would be a close game. I just think that the Steelers' defense was so overwhelming and so superior to any defense I've ever seen. I mean, there were a couple of teams that were reasonably close, but that Steelers defense in the 70s was just, they were just impossible for any offense to deal with.
Wow. Yeah, I think when you do comparisons like that, within a decade, I don't think a team from the 60s could compare to a team for today. But I think maybe the 90s Cowboys.
Let's not compare teams, but compare players. If Jim Brown was playing today, he'd be the best running back in the NFL. If he played in the 90s, he'd have been the best running back in the NFL. If he played in the 70s, he'd have been the best running back in the NFL. I mean, Jim Brown has a record that is never going to be broken by any running back ever. He for his career, I'm not talking about 1 year, career, averaged over 5 yards per carry, averaged over 100 yards per game, and averaged over a touchdown per game. And he wasn't playing on great teams, but believe me, he was not. I'll tell you a story about something I saw in person, probably when the Giants became terrible. They traded Sam Huff to the Washington Redskins. This is probably 1964, maybe, and maybe 65. And Tom Brookshire, by that time, was already an announcer, the color guy, and he was interviewing certain players on the field with the mic in his hand. And Sam Huff comes over with no shoulder pads, and he's got this practice jersey with holes in it. And after about 2 or 3 minutes, he says, he says, Sam, what's with the holes in the jersey? He says, those are Jimmy Brown cleat marks. I thought that was pretty funny.
Did you ever see the Violent World of Sam Huff?
Yeah, he also went to West Virginia. I don't know if it was I think it was a book originally. If they made a movie out of it, I'm not aware of it.
Well, no, it wasn't a movie. It was the CBS. I think it was a half-hour documentary. That's what they did. Yes.
The Giants' defense in those days, they had a great defense back in the late 50s, early 60s with Jim Catkavage, Andy Robustelli, Rosie Greer was on that team, Sam Huff, 3 or 4 other really good defensive players, Jimmy Patton.
Wasn't Landry still a player in the early 50s, or was that the late 40s?
Well, first of all, Landry I think served in the Air Force, and I'm not sure if he was there for World War II, but he was I think a pilot or something like that in the Air Force back in World War II, and he was also a defensive back at what school I can't remember. He was a very smart guy, and the defense was his forte, and he's giving credit for being the creator of the 4-3 defense. also the flex defense. They had some great players on those Dallas teams back in the 60s and up until about 1975.
Had it not been for Pittsburgh, they probably would have been the dynasty of that decade.
Yep. They had some really good quarterbacks. I mean, another guy I admire is Roger Staubach. Roger Staubach won the Heisman Trophy at the Naval Academy as a junior, and then after he graduated, he had to serve 2 years in the Navy, active duty, before he could. And he was drafted by the Cowboys in like the 7th or 8th round. The Cowboys in those days drafted extremely well. They had these metrics that they used. I don't know what they were exactly, to evaluate players, and they did a great job of drafting in those days.
Do you know the guy that oversaw their scouting department?
Gil Brandt, I think his name was.
Yep.
And he's still around, and he's still doing some draft analysis. You got to be in his 80s. And Staubach was, like I said, drafted in the 6th or 7th round, and he won a Super Bowl. And he, after he retired, became a major investor in real estate, and eventually sold his corporation, I think, to either Remax or one of those big national real estate agencies for $300 million. So the guy is a multi-millionaire. Well, he kept in touch with a lot of old Cowboy players who fell on hard times, and he helped every one of them out. Either gave them jobs or, lent them money or whatever he did. The guy is very, very generous with his time and with his money.
Yeah, he definitely has that all-American spirit. I mean, listening, whenever I was watching an interview with Tom Landry, like from the old NFL films, he talks about like how Roger had to work hard to kind of advance with the pro game, because he was a big running quarterback in the beginning, and it wasn't really until he got to the Cowboys where he had to learn how to pass.
They called him Roger the Dodger.
That's funny.
Like Fran talking to Fran the Scram.
Yeah. I think he's a guy that even if you weren't a Cowboys fan, you still appreciated him.
Yeah, I admired him. I admired Bart Starr and a few other players.
Thanks again, everyone, for listening. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter and Instagram, and reach out to me at thefootballodyssey.com or at sportshistorynetwork.com. Take care until next time.